My wife of 38 years had been in the ground less than 6 hours when my son asked me if I'd mind eating at the kitchen counter from now on, since the dining room was going to be staged for the appraisal. They inherited her $42 million business, the dealerships, the warehouses, the properties across 3 states. I received a coffee tin. Mocked and dismissed, told the guest room over the garage would suit me fine. I carried that tin out to my truck that night and drove until I found a motel with a working ice machine. Inside the tin was a folded photograph, a small brass key, and a note in my late wife's handwriting. It read, "For the only man who never once asked me what I was worth." When I finally understood what that key opened, I realized my children had just handed me the rest of my life. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments what state you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had people you loved look right through you like you were furniture, hit that like button because this one's for you. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 61 years old, and until 11 days ago, I thought I understood my family. For 38 years, I stood next to Diane Briggs while she built something most people spend their whole lives only dreaming about. She started with one used car lot on the edge of Tulsa, a gravel yard with a double-wide trailer for an office. And by the time the cancer took her, she owned 6 dealerships across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, along with the warehouses that supplied their parts and 2 apartment complexes she'd picked up almost as an afterthought during the 2009 crash. Diane had a gift. She could look at a failing lot and see the version of it that worked. I never had that gift. What I had was steadier hands and a willingness to do whatever needed doing, whether that meant running numbers until 2 in the morning or driving 4 hours to pick up a part myself because a shipment fell through. People who met us assumed I worked for her. Most of the time, I let them believe it. It never bothered me. I had married Diane because I loved her, not because I wanted my name on a building. The funeral was held at Cedarbrook Community Church, the same one Diane had insisted on attending every Sunday, even after she could have afforded a cathedral. 300 people came. Business partners, competitors who respected her, employees who'd been with us since the gravel lot days, half of whom were crying harder than my own children were. I sat in the front pew in the suit Diane had picked out for me 2 Christmases ago, and I felt like the floor had opened up beneath the whole world. I kept expecting her to walk in late, the way she always did, apologizing under her breath and squeezing my hand as she sat down. She never came. And by the time we got back to the house for the reception, my son Marcus was already on the phone with a commercial appraiser. I watched him from the hallway, still in his black suit, pacing the length of Diane's home office with his cell phone pressed to his ear, asking someone named Todd how quickly they could get a valuation on the whole portfolio, not just the retail locations. He did not lower his voice when I walked past. He didn't seem to register that I'd walked past at all. My daughter Renee was in the kitchen with her husband Grant, going through Diane's recipe box like it was a filing cabinet, setting aside anything with a $sign written in the corner, which was Diane's private code for investments she'd made under different LLCs over the years. Grant had a legal pad. He was taking inventory. My daughter-in-law, Priya, was walking room to room with her phone out, not taking photos of Diane, not one, but photographing the furniture, the light fixtures, the crown molding, the kind of photos you take when you're already imagining what a place will look like once it's yours. Not one of them asked me how I was holding up. Not one of them brought me a plate of food or sat with me for 5 minutes in that front pew of a living room while I tried to remember how to breathe around the hole she'd left in the middle of my chest. To them, I understood, watching it unfold in real time, I had always been the quiet man in the background of Diane's success, the one who fixed the printer, who signed for deliveries, who never once sat at the head of the table because Diane always insisted I take the seat beside her. They called me, behind my back and sometimes not even behind my back, Mom's assistant. I'd heard Marcus say it once at a Christmas party, half joking, to a room of his college friends. I always laughed along. It was easier than explaining that I'd turned down running my own small engine repair shop back in 1994 because Diane needed me more, because 2 people chasing 2 dreams meant neither dream got the attention it deserved. And I had decided, freely, that hers was the one worth chasing together. The reading of the will took place 4 days later in a downtown Tulsa law office with dark paneled walls and a view of the river. Diane's longtime attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harold Whitfield, who'd known her since the gravel lot days, sat across a long table from the 5 of us. Marcus sat up straight, already dressed like a man accepting an award. Renee had brought a small notebook. Priya and Grant sat slightly behind their spouses, present but performing patience. Harold read through the preliminary language, the standard legal framework, and then got to the part everyone in that room, except me, had been waiting for. Diane Briggs left the entirety of her business holdings, the 6 dealerships, the parts warehouses, the 2 apartment complexes, and all associated operating accounts split between Marcus and Renee, 60% and 40% respectively, effective immediately. Marcus exhaled like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying his whole life. Renee's hand went to her mouth, and for a moment I thought it might be grief. It wasn't. Priya reached over and squeezed Renee's knee under the table, already calculating, I would learn later, what 40% of a business valued somewhere north of $40 million actually meant in terms of a new house in the Preston Hollow neighborhood of Dallas she'd had her eye on for 2 years. Then Harold turned a page, cleared his throat, and said that the remaining item in the estate was a single personal bequest to me. He reached into a document box and set a small, unremarkable object on the table. A coffee tin. The old red Folgers kind, dented at one corner, the paint faded down to bare metal in places. I recognized it instantly. It had sat on a shelf in our garage for as long as I could remember, holding loose screws and spare fuses. Marcus actually laughed. Not cruelly, not at first, more like a nervous exhale that came out wrong. That's it? A coffee can? Renee didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. She just looked faintly embarrassed on my behalf, the way you'd feel if someone tripped in public and you weren't sure whether to help them up or pretend you hadn't seen. Grant, who I had never once heard address me directly by name in 9 years of marriage to my daughter, leaned back in his chair and said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that maybe it was for the best. That running 6 dealerships was a young person's game anyway, and that I'd earned a rest. He said the word rest the way you'd say it to someone you were putting out to pasture. I did not say anything. I picked up the tin, thanked Harold, and drove home in silence. That evening, Marcus came to find me in the garage, where I'd retreated after dinner, mostly to be away from the sound of Renee and Priya on speakerphone, with a realtor discussing timeline for transitioning the family home. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and for one brief moment I thought my son was going to say something human to me. Instead, he told me that he and Renee had talked, and given everything, they thought it made sense for me to move into the apartment over the garage. Just temporarily, he said, while they figured out the logistics of the estate. He said Priya had already measured it and thought with a fresh coat of paint it could be really cozy. I looked at my son, 34 years old, standing in the garage where I had taught him to change his own oil, where I had held the bike seat while he learned to ride without training wheels, and I asked him if he understood that this was still my house too. He said, and I will remember this exactly as long as I live, that legally it wasn't. Mom's estate plan had put the house under the same holding company as everything else, for tax purposes, he explained, like he was doing me a favor by walking me through it. He said Renee and I would obviously make sure I was taken care of. He used the word obviously the way people use it when they have not thought about you at all. I did not argue. I went out to my truck that night, coffee tin on the passenger seat, and I drove 40 minutes to a Best Western off the interstate because I could not spend one more hour in a house where I had just been informed, gently obviously, that I was a guest. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with the ice machine humming outside my door, and I finally opened the tin. Inside was a photograph, folded in quarters, soft at the creases from having been handled many times. It was a picture of Diane and me standing in front of that first gravel lot in 1988, both of us impossibly young. Her arm looped through mine, both of us laughing at something the camera never caught. Beneath the photograph was a small brass key, old-fashioned, the kind that opens a padlock rather than a modern deadbolt. And beneath the key was a folded square of paper in Diane's handwriting, the same looping cursive she used on every anniversary card she'd given me for 38 years. It read, Walter, if you're reading this alone in some cheap motel because our children have already shown you who they've become, I want you to know I saw it coming, and I am so sorry I didn't fix it while I still could. This tin is for the only man who never once asked me what I was worth. The key opens the storage unit on Route 9, the one under your name, not mine, that nobody but you and I have ever known about. Go there before you do anything else. Everything I built because you made it possible to build it. I never told them that because I thought they'd understand it on their own one day. I was wrong. Go to the storage unit, Walter. Then go see Harold. Ask him about the Wren Creek Holdings paperwork. I love you more than any business I ever built. I sat there for a long time. Then I drove to Route 9. The storage unit was larger than I expected, climate-controlled, the kind of place that costs real money every month. Inside, under a canvas tarp, was a fireproof filing cabinet, and inside that, 17 years of documents I had never seen. Diane had, back in 2009, during the crash, quietly restructured the ownership of everything. Not the dealerships themselves, which stayed in her name and were now, per the will, Marcus and Renee's inheritance, but the land underneath every single one of those 6 dealership lots, the warehouses, the 2 apartment complexes, all of it sat on real estate that Diane had transferred 17 years ago into a separate holding entity called Wren Creek Holdings. And Wren Creek Holdings had one sole owner listed on every document: me. I called Harold the next morning, my hands actually shaking as I dialed. He confirmed it in under a minute, like he'd been waiting his whole career for someone to finally ask him this exact question. Diane had done it quietly, legally, and completely above board back when she still had the clarity of mind to see a future she hoped would never arrive. Marcus and Renee had inherited the operating businesses. The cars, the inventory, the brand names, the employee contracts, the bank accounts tied to daily revenue. But every dealership sat on land they did not own. Every warehouse. Both apartment complexes. All of it belonged to Wren Creek Holdings, and Wren Creek Holdings belonged, in full, to me. Harold told me, gently, that Diane had done this after a conversation the two of them had, years back, when Marcus was going through a rough stretch in his 20s, mismanaging money, and Diane had confided to Harold that she was afraid of exactly this. Afraid that success handed to her children without the years of struggle behind it might curdle into something ugly. She hadn't wanted to believe it. She'd hoped, every year since, that she was wrong about them. She never got the chance to find out. I did not act right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. For the first several days after the reading of Diane's real intentions, I mostly just grieved in a motel room, alone. In a way I had not let myself grieve since the funeral, because for the first time since Diane died, nobody needed anything from me, and I did not have to perform composure for anybody's benefit. It was Priya who forced my hand 3 weeks later, though she never knew it. I received, forwarded from my own former address by a neighbor who still had my new number, an official notice. The dealership operations, now under Marcus and Renee's control, were being served with a lease default notice. The property management arm handling Wren Creek's lots, which I had, without realizing it, been ignoring calls from for weeks, had sent formal notification that ground rent on all 6 dealership properties was 90 days past due, along with the 2 apartment complexes. And unless resolved, eviction proceedings on all commercial locations would begin within 30 days. I hadn't even known there was rent owed. I called the property manager, a straightforward woman named Carol, who'd apparently been handling this account for Diane for over a decade. And Carol explained, somewhat confused as to why I hadn't known, that Marcus had called her office 2 weeks after the funeral and informed her that going forward, the family would be renegotiating lease terms downward, given the change in ownership structure, and that until new terms were agreed upon, they would simply be withholding payment as leverage. My son had tried to strong-arm a landlord he did not know was his own father. I drove to Tulsa that afternoon for the first time in a month. I did not go to the house. I went to the flagship dealership, the original one Diane had built her empire from, now glass and steel and 100 cars gleaming under floodlights. I asked the receptionist for Marcus, and she, not recognizing me in a way that stung more than I expected, asked who was calling. I told her Walter Briggs, Wren Creek Holdings. Marcus came out of his office looking irritated at the interruption, the irritation curdling into confusion when he saw it was me, and further into something like alarm when I told him I was there in my capacity as the property owner regarding the 90 days of unpaid ground rent. He laughed, actually laughed, the same nervous laugh from the will reading, and told me that was ridiculous, that Wren Creek was some shell entity Mom's lawyers had probably set up decades ago and it had nothing to do with me. I told him to call Harold. I told him to look at the deed. I watched my son's face change in real time as he pulled it up on his phone, standing in the lobby of a business he thought was entirely his, and understood for the first time that his father, The man he'd offered a room over the garage like a kindness owned the ground beneath his feet. Every lot, every warehouse, both apartment buildings where dozens of families paid rent that flowed, ultimately, to me. Renee arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by a panicked call from her brother, and I watched the two of them try, together, to talk their way out of the corner they'd built for themselves. Renee tried warmth first, told me she'd always meant to check in more. That grief made people say and do things they didn't mean, that of course they'd sort out the rent. Family didn't need to involve lawyers. Marcus tried the opposite, tried to remind me that legally the operating businesses were his and Renee's, that I couldn't simply raise rent to punish them, that there were tenant protections. I told them both, calmly, that I was not there to punish anyone. I was there because I had received an official default notice on 6 commercial properties and 2 apartment complexes. And as the owner, I had an obligation to resolve it, one way or another, within 30 days. I gave them a choice. They could bring the ground rent current at market rate going forward, the same rate any other business owner would pay to lease that land, or I would begin the process of terminating the lease agreements and finding new tenants, which Carol had already informed me there was no shortage of interest in, given the locations. Marcus told me I was bluffing, that I would never actually evict my own children's business. I told him that 11 days ago I had been offered a room above a garage by my own son while my wife's body was still warm, and that people who make that kind of decision about family shouldn't be surprised when family stops feeling obligated to make it easy for them. They did not bring the rent current. Instead, and I only learned the full details of this later, through Carol and through Harold, Marcus and Renee spent the next several weeks trying to find a way around me entirely. They approached a regional investment group about buying out the operating businesses outright for cash, planning to simply relocate the dealerships to new land and walk away from Wren Creek altogether, which would have worked structurally if the investment group hadn't insisted, as part of due diligence, on a full accounting of outstanding liabilities, at which point their own attorney discovered that in the scramble to raise emergency capital, Grant had personally guaranteed a business loan against apartment units that were, again, on land they didn't own, without disclosing that fact to the lender, which technically constituted a form of loan fraud serious enough that the investment group walked away entirely and Grant's name ended up flagged with the State Banking Commission. I did not orchestrate that. I want to be clear about that too. I never once picked up the phone and called that investment group. I simply owned land and told the truth to anyone who asked me directly, including Carol, including Harold, including, eventually, a very nervous investment analyst who called me personally to verify the deed. By the time the 30 days ran out, Marcus and Renee had no capital, no buyer, a business partner in Grant who was now under state investigation, and 6 locations sitting on land whose owner they had personally, publicly, humiliated at a will reading less than 2 months earlier. They asked to meet me, all 4 of them, at Harold's office, the same room where this had all started. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to hear whatever they had to say in a room with witnesses. Renee spoke first, and to her credit, she did not try to manage me the way she had at the dealership. She said she was sorry, actually sorry, that grief had made her cruel in ways she hadn't recognized until it was too late, that she'd looked back at the last 2 months and felt sick at who she'd been. Priya sat quietly beside her, saying nothing, which after everything felt almost honest. Marcus, for his part, offered what I can only describe as a negotiation disguised as an apology. He proposed that if I simply forgave the back rent and locked in a below-market long-term lease, he would ensure I received, as he put it, a fair monthly amount enough to live comfortably. He named a figure, $2,000 a month, from a business generating tens of millions in annual revenue, sitting on land I owned outright. I told him that number sounded familiar. It was almost exactly what he told me, at the will reading, I should expect to live on going forward, back when he thought I had nothing at all. I did not raise my voice. I told them that I was not interested in punishing anyone for the rest of their lives, and that Renee's apology, unlike Marcus's offer, actually sounded like it came from somewhere real. So here was what I intended to do. I would bring in a property management firm, at market rate, standard commercial terms, the same terms any stranger would receive. If the businesses could operate profitably under fair terms, they were welcome to keep operating. If they could not, that was a business problem, not a family punishment. and they would need to figure it out the way any business owner figures out a hard year, which is something, I reminded them, their mother had done from a gravel lot with a double-wide trailer, with nobody's help at all. I told Marcus that his $2,000 offer told me everything I needed to know about what he thought I was worth, and that I had spent 38 years letting people underestimate me because I loved someone more than I loved being seen, and I was done doing that now that she was gone. I stood up to leave. Renee asked quietly if there was any chance someday, once the dust settled, that we could try to be a family again. Not about the money, just as people. I told her the door wasn't closed. But it wasn't going to be measured in monthly payments or apartment renovations either. It was going to be measured in whether she showed up, actually showed up, the way I had shown up for her mother for 38 years without once asking what it was worth to me. I left Harold's office and drove out past the original lot, the one from the photograph in the coffee tin, the gravel long since paved over, and I sat in my truck for a while, looking at the place where it all began, where a woman who saw something in a failing patch of dirt had also, all those years later, seen something coming in her own children that she couldn't bring herself to say out loud while she was alive. I think about that note more than almost anything else these days. For the only man who never once asked me what I was worth. I spent 38 years believing my worth was never really the point. I'm 61 years old, and I'm only now understanding that the people who love you honestly never make you ask that question in the first place. It's the ones measuring the dining room for staging, while you're still grieving in the corner, who make you wonder, if you've ever had to learn later in life than you'd like, exactly who was standing beside you and who was only ever standing near you, tell me about it in the comments. And if this reached you tonight, subscribe, because there's more of this journey still to come.